right, thank you, everyone. We're down to the home stretch of this very engaging conversation, and we want to get it started because we have a packed agenda for the rest of the afternoon. So thank you for getting back to your seats, finding your places. Please, if you see any empty seats and you're looking for one, just take it. I think some people have shuffled, so if you see an empty seat, feel free to take it. Okay, so this afternoon, our panel is entitled Bringing It All Together in New York City, Implementing Anti-Displacement and Equitable Development Policies and Practices. And we are delighted to have a cross-section of different stakeholders in our field of community development and affordable housing on the panel here with us today. And I think we'll really be picking up on many of the themes that you've heard throughout the day in that very, very engaging conversation we just came out of from other cities around the country. I want to introduce you to our moderator, Michelle DeLauz, who is a longtime partner of LISCs. She is the executive director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, a preeminent community development and nonprofit affordable housing organization serving over 5,000 low and moderate income people in South Brooklyn. Another reason she is so well suited to this role today is that she also is a member of the New York City Planning Commission. She's been on it since 2012. And so she really wears a policy-making hat as well. And thirdly, she is on the LISC National Board of Directors. So perfect person to lead this conversation this afternoon. And we thank her very much for doing that. As a reminder, just before I let the panel take it away, just want to let you know that we are going to have a facilitated conversation from 4 to 4:30, and we are welcoming your questions through either the email address we've been showing you, ecdev@lisc.org, or the printed pieces of paper on your table. Also, please feel free to share your thoughts, things that strike you, whatever, at our hashtag ecdev2016. So with that, Michelle, I'm going to let you take it away.
Great. So I know that, raise your hand if you've been here since early this morning. Okay. So I know a lot of folks are very anxious to get involved in this conversation, and I think you'll be able to do that when the next two panels are complete. But I think that we have some fantastic folks on this panel, which is bringing it all together here in New York City, implementing anti-displacement and equitable development policies and practices. Because the bio's already in your packets, I'm not going to go through the long details, but I just want to say that we have Karim Hudson, the founder and managing partner of Genesis Companies. We have Dina Levy, Director of Community Impact and Innovation at New York State Attorney General's Eric Schneiderman's office. We have Michelle Neugebauer, the other Michelle, the Executive Director of Cypress Hills LDC. I'm also called the other Michelle, just so you know. And then we have Wendy Takahisa, Executive Director at Morgan Stanley, who heads up their CRA efforts. I think that, obviously those of us who've lived in New York City either part or all of our lives know that it's a high-cost city, it's a global city, that's attracting significant investment. And that trend coupled, and much of that investment is increasingly unregulated investment. And that trend coupled with public actions and, many of us would say inaction, is leading to significant displacement of folks of color and low and moderate income people in New York City. So this is something that many of us who are on the ground in neighborhoods in New York City and working around anti-displacement and anti-eviction efforts know firsthand what's going on. And I think, we also have the perspective, many different perspectives here on the panel. And so, one of the first things that came up this morning in the first panel about research really was that there's not a common definition of what displacement is. And, there's really two parts to this conversation, right? There's the displacement question, and then there's the equitable development question. And so that's actually the first question that I have for our panelists. From their perspectives as a for-profit, mixed-income affordable housing developer, or someone that works for the Attorney General's office and is always coming up with creative ways to try to enforce existing legislation, someone at a financial institution, and obviously a community development advocate and affordable housing developer. If you guys can share your definitions of displacement and equitable development, I think that would be helpful. I'll start with Dina on my left, and then we'll go down.
Thanks, Michelle. So I think in addition to thinking that there's different definitions, I think there's also many different ways that displacement can happen. I don't know, am I speaking loud enough into this thing? So I'm going to just focus on two that I think we've been sort of keenly looking at recently and that I think are interesting depending on where you are in the state. So the first, I think, big issue that we're struggling with, again, unfortunately, is in hot markets like here in New York City, where we've seen the return of very, very, very aggressive underwriting of real estate deals. So we've got many, many people from private equity investors to institutional investors, some landlords, some lending institutions, are once again underwriting deals in a way that they simply cannot make their return unless virtually everybody in the building leaves. And this is not really sort of like a subtle type of over-leveraging, like it started out maybe 10 years ago. This is not a decimal point. These are literally wildly, wildly crazy expectations in terms of what percentage of the existing families who live in these buildings, what percentage of those have to go to make this return work. And I think as long as that's true, people are going to continue to be displaced, whether it's legally, by offering things like buyouts, which can be technically legal, or whether it's less legally, but by invoking very, very aggressive forms of harassment. At the same time, we're seeing a slightly different form of displacement, and this is actually, now that I work for a state-level politician, when we're looking at markets that are still struggling to come back from the foreclosure crisis, so softer markets, whether they're here in New York City or whether they're in the Hudson Valley or Long Island or particularly upstate, there what we saw was at the time that the foreclosure crisis really hit the crescendo, many, many, many small-time speculators came into those markets and acquired 1 to 4 unit properties at very, very low prices, many of whom don't really know anything about owning real estate or renting real estate. And frankly, when you go into many of these towns, 1 to 4 unit properties are pretty much the entirety of the affordable rental stock. So that is where low to moderate income people are living. And unfortunately, I think these speculators know that municipalities are overtaxed and don't have the resources either from a code enforcement perspective or from a legal perspective to keep up with the enforcement of the local maintenance and housing codes. And so you find families are sort of faced with the choice of either staying in deplorable living conditions or becoming homeless, moving into a shelter. And those are sort of the options. And I would say, when I talk to elected officials outside of New York City, particularly, this is probably their #1 challenge from a housing perspective and from an affordable housing perspective, and leading to massive amounts of displacement. So I would say that that's sort of a couple definitions of what we're seeing in the displacement space. I would say the sort of equitable development is getting people to stop doing that, right? And so across the board. So, that's kind of cheeky, but I actually mean it. And from where I sit now, right, I don't work for a developer, I work for an enforcement official. I think we have to do a better job, and by we I also mean me, a better job of figuring out legislative, legal, and regulatory strategies that really penalizes those who are taking advantage of the market and forcing this type of displacement.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thanks. Well, I started out coming here thinking, well, I sort of know what it is, and I didn't have to do things, and then I took about 4 pages of notes, at least during all of the morning panels. I think fundamentally this is about a right for people to be able to stay in their communities, and to stay in their communities in safe and affordable and decent housing. And so I'm going to break and tell a little story, which I think is interesting. So I work at Morgan Stanley. We're very focused on financing affordable housing. And actually, I was taught never to say affordable housing, but always to say quality affordable housing, because we never want to do just affordable housing. So we were working with some folks who were renovating distressed, some of the worst properties in the Bronx, some of the ones that had been identified by both UNHP, by Dina Levy, by the city as amongst the worst. And we were working with what we hoped were responsible developers to correct some of those. And they came in for a meeting with us one day, and they were signing in at our security desk. And it turned out that one of the security guards was the president of the Tenants Association in the building. This was not planned. And she was so thrilled to see these folks because, in fact, they were the responsible people. They were fixing her building, which she had lived in for decades and had suffered. It was one of the worst buildings in New York. It had suffered through tremendous disinvestment, predatory equity, and it was fun. And she finally had somebody that she could call to get the front door locks fixed, to get the laundry room working. So it's fundamentally, equitable development is about allowing these folks a right to stay where they've been living in safe and affordable housing.
Good afternoon. I don't want to. I agree with the definitions that have been aforementioned, so I don't want to belabor the point. But look, I grew up in Harlem. I live in Harlem still. I develop in Harlem and other places in the city. My wife and I are, as anybody who's in New York, everybody knows New York is block to block, right? And sometimes on the block, you're house to house. We've lived where we live now for the last 5, 7, 8 years. We haven't moved. We get knocks on the door from people who see us as sophisticated real estate folks. And they'll come and say, hey, I live down the block. Somebody is actually looking to take me out of my house, right? Gee whiz, I'm on this subsidy level and I haven't gotten, this leak in my apartment fixed in 2 months. And then the guy's saying, I can't do it X, Y, Z. I can't get my son who's lived with me my whole life on the lease. The landlord's refusing to do this. So, these are the issues that, practical every day that, smell like, taste like displacement. And so, that's the everyday struggle. That's what we see, I think, in the neighborhoods, and that's what we're trying to counteract.
So I came up with a couple of definitions. For me, equitable development is guided and governed by the plans and aspirations of the residents, small businesses, and local institutions in communities undergoing redevelopment. For me, it's also development that improves the incomes, life chances, housing, and health of the most vulnerable and the lowest income residents of neighborhoods. And in terms of displacement, of course, it's people involuntarily being forced out of their neighborhoods, not only residents, but longtime business operators, manufacturers, and neighborhood institutions like houses of worship. But it's also the disruption of social networks.
Great, thank you. The one thing I didn't, well, that's actually not true. Dina certainly talked about markets that are, what can happen when a market is unregulated. But, I'm just wondering, do you feel like there are people walking around maybe who aren't represented on this panel? We can imagine Rebney perhaps might have a slightly different definition, but maybe not. How do you think some other folks might define displacement, and how does that feed into the kinds of policy choices or practices that are being implemented? Go ahead. No, I think anyone. In particular on the prep call, I know, Karim, you had some thoughts on this. How might some other people frame the issues of displacement and equitable development differently? Because I think that leads to different approaches.
You mean from a market standpoint,
Yes.
potentially? Mm-hmm. Well, look, we are in a special marketplace. Everybody realizes that. We talked about, the subprime crisis, but we talked about the enormous exuberance that occurred, right, in early 2000s, right, and for a crash in 2008, and now we're in a very interesting market where interest rates are low. There's very little that people can do to manipulate the economy, it seems. The Fed really is out of tools. So really, if the Fed is out of tools, it's hard to see how HPD or HTC or Jamie Rubin can manipulate the economy. But the truth is that there's an enormous amount of cash that's looking for a return, right? And so for me, a lot of it is about the movement of cash flows with a profit motivation. That's the structure of how our economy is built, and so the interest in affordable properties being purchased by private equity with underwriting assumptions that may seem exuberant, at the bottom line of it is that they pencil out, and there's a risk that an investor is willing to take to grab that return at some risk profile. And so it seems to me like if there's going to be some sort of discussion around how do you curtail that, there has to be some discussion about how do you manipulate capital flows into the market, in my opinion, in a pro-market way, because I don't think we can assume that this market is going to last forever, that it's not going to be the case that this hyperactivity and that this dearth of profitable projects it will continue into the long term. I will also say this, that I am not going to be like my economics professor who told me when I was a little kid that discrimination cannot happen in the marketplace over the long term. And I want to say
Sounds like
that,
an economist.
Yeah, in the long term, I'm sure we will all be dead. So we have to deal with specific inequities that are in the market, and we need people like the AG's office, and we need social activity, we need nonprofits, and we need for-profits to be responsible and to figure out. To me, that's the role of the government, is to figure out what positive externalities exist, what dislocations exist, when inequality exists, and try to figure out pro-market ways to deal with that, and to do that in a way that is that gives full information to the market so that they can now revise their own profit motivations to deal with that.
Great. I think it's important to have that perspective represented. I just want to, we started to hear a little bit about some of the examples and trends that people are seeing. You each have unique vantage points about what you're seeing from your perspectives, and I'm just wondering if you could share some examples or trends of displacement or equitable development that you think are important for this audience to hear about. I'm going to start on the far end this time with Michelle.
I'm just so impressed you had an economics professor as a child. So in terms of trends, for somebody who did not have an economics professor as a child, so I work in Cypress Hills, East New York. For the past 3 decades, it's been a very vibrant, healthy, low and moderate income, small homes neighborhood, mostly Latino. And as everyone knows, we're the first neighborhood up in the mayor's housing plan for densification and upzoning. And so the changes that we're beginning, and we also need to acknowledge, are the next neighborhood over in the Brooklyn gentrification wave from Bed-Stuy and Bushwick. So the changes that we've started to experience from the announcement of the rezoning was definitely an increase in real estate speculation, almost immediately really exorbitant increases in land values, and we've seen very steady rises in the increases of sales prices in two-family homes. And along with that, a lot more flipping of two-family homes. And the Center for New York City Neighborhood has documented that flipping. We also have been experiencing tremendous rent pressures. We have, as our Director of Community Organizing can attest to, 5 to 6 families a day coming into our storefront office who live in small family homes that are saying their landlord is increasing their rent and what can they do about it? Is that legal? Yes, it's legal. We have a few commercial leases not being renewed on our neighborhood shopping corridor, Fulton Street. And then we've started to see really obnoxious and hopefully at some point illegal practices of the local real estate community, really pushing apartments for young professionals, for artists. We have seen some artists that were displaced from Bushwick moving into the neighborhood. And then on Atlantic Avenue, which is the corridor that's getting the most density bump up, we have many multifamily buildings on Atlantic Avenue, and we've started to see landlords really aggressively pushing for evictions and starting to harass tenants on Atlantic Avenue. And we have, multiple strategies that we're using to try to address all those situations.
Thank you. And Krim has a perspective both of Harlem, and I know you've done some development in New Jersey too. So anything you want to share there?
Well, look, I mean, let's talk about Harlem. I mean, we all know the amount of activity that's happened up there, north of 110th Street, east and west, a lot of central Harlem. The upzone that took place that really spurred, the Frederick Douglass Boulevard corridor, and just the general movement of wealth up the avenues. And so, a lot of what, Michelle is talking about, second Michelle, the first Michelle, are true. But the flip side is that Harlem is a different place in some good and some bad ways. I mean, the truth is that having lived in Harlem for quite a long time, there was not the access to services and amenities that there are now. There wasn't access to healthy food as there were now. I remember my wife and I used to go all the way down to the Whole Foods on Upper West Side just to get groceries. And they wouldn't even deliver up past 110th Street. I mean, you guys know those days when nobody would deliver past 110th Street. I mean, it's ridiculousness, right? I remember when I went to school on the Upper East Side, it was like a divide between 96th Street, right? You wouldn't go past 96th Street. I mean, this is New York stuff, right? That we deal with. And now, we can still go shop at the Whole Foods on Upper West Side, and we can get it delivered up to our apartment, always in the 130s. And that's really something that we should be entitled to, don't you think? Certainly the decrease in crime has been positive, and so trying to figure out ways to do that and pro-community wage is important, and that's been a positive. Look, I think that there needs to be development. Whenever there's an investment, there's development. I mean, we just did a deal with the city where we preserved 358 units of housing. Not one unit had a rent increase. We took buildings that had a lot of issues, and we brought them up to the code. They had hundreds of violations, and we had to do the hard work in getting in there, not displacing tenants and not raising rents. And it cost the city a lot of money to do it, but I think the city was committed to doing it. And so I think that's hard work that has to get done. I don't know how much of it we can do, but we also did that and flying in the pressure of a market that said, hey, an alternative is that this seller could take this market. And so we had to deal with that pressure, and you can't ignore that. I think those are all the difficulties of a neighborhood that's growing and emerging, and probably past emerging, but maturing, and trying to figure out ways to stop inequity and stop displacement, I think, is the trick. But you want to always be improving upon the base that you have. You never want to stop improving, and capital flows and markets are a good thing to do that, and we want to motivate them to come in to invest. And it's not always a bad thing if retail is improving and looking different, because as the neighborhood changes and needs change, you want retail to change as well, because at the end of the day, it has to be receptive to what the demand is for folks. And so I remember when I took over the portfolio, I talked to folks that had the bodegas, and then I said, listen, we got to do something better than just hanging up a bodega sign and selling, stuff outside the door. We've got to try to make it look a little bit nicer so people can walk on the streets and feel good about the neighborhood, and challenging folks to do more. And a lot of folks said, you know what? I do recognize that the neighborhood is changing, that people want healthier foods, not just new residents, actually the old residents that lived here want healthier food, and I have to figure out a way to sell items that appeal to them. And they had to do that work, and we forced them to do that work in the renewal process. And so some of that can be good change, but we also have to monitor the negative.
Great.
So first of all, I want to say we're at Morgan Stanley, very proud to be one of Kareem's supporters and financiers of the properties that they're working on up there. And I think it is really incumbent upon the banks to make sure that you work with responsible developers and that you work to preserve housing. We have a huge program actually with LISC and the National Equity Fund, their partner, to ensure the preservation of the Year 15 buildings. And one of the ways we put this program together was by providing capital to National Equity Fund so that when a property was coming up for the end of their compliance period, NEF could quickly acquire it, giving the local nonprofits the ability to have the 18 to 36 months that they need to put together their financing package, because they're frequently not as nimble or as deep-pocketed as the developers. So I think there are a number of things that banks and others can do to support responsible development, and I think it's really incumbent upon the banks to do so. I'll just, because you told me I could, I'm going to diverge for a second. I want to give you my personal story because people talked all the time about being from New York, and Kareem mentioned being. So I was born and spent the first probably 7 years of my life in NYCHA housing, in public housing. I moved from there to Mitchell-Lama housing, so went sort of along the way. From there, I moved when I came back into rent-stabilized housing. So I sort of went through the whole gambit, and bought my first very small studio apartment in what was then known as the meat market, because it really was a meat market, and there were carcasses out the door, and it was a block not too far from where my parents had lived in the late 40s and 50s. So they were horrified that I was moving back. But it also, what was interesting for them coming back was the number of restaurants and mom and pops that were the same as when they had lived there more than 30 years prior. I moved out of that about 20 years ago now, up to Chelsea, which the New York Times wrote about as one of the most bifurcated places in New York City, with NYCHA housing cheek by jowl with kind of things. And when I go back to the now meat market, I don't recognize a thing. It's like less than 15, 20 years, and it's a completely different neighborhood. So I think as we think about neighborhoods and developments and responsible development, there's just a whole picture there.
You know, Wendy, one thing that came up in our prep call was, and in particular in your perspective, you know, leading CRA at Morgan Stanley. Can you talk a little bit about what role, if any, that you believe CRA has in relation to displacement?
Oh, sure. I have a half an hour, right? Something like that. So I'm just going to remind people that CRA was written in 1977, and it was a very different city. It was a very different country. And let's face it, CRA was originally, the genesis of it is really racial redlining, although when they finally passed the law, they took race out of it entirely, and it became solely about low income, and that I assume that made it palatable for politically to pass the regulation. And if you read the regulation, it talks about banks having an affirmative obligation to invest in low and moderate income communities and low and moderate income people, but it was really about communities because it was about redlining. And if you remember the 70s, and those of us who were here, there were 100,000 units of in-rem housing. We were worried about bringing capital back into the communities. That was what everybody was worried about. So I don't think we could have, I mean, maybe people could have crystal balled the problems we're facing today, but it's a different world today. And fundamentally, I will tell you, I don't think CRA is well suited to being the best tool for dealing with these problems. I think there are things that can be done and that are being done. I was talking to Ron Schiffman earlier about the fact that I think it's true that because banks got quote-unquote CRA credit, whatever that means, it's another 20 minutes, for investing in low and moderate income neighborhoods, frankly for years regardless of what the housing was or who it was meant for, I think that has largely stopped from all of the regulators. It may be a little bit about closing the barn door after the horses left. And I think the regulators are getting smarter, but we have to remember that this is CRA, which was fundamentally about bringing investments back into low and moderate income communities, and that's not the issue on the table today. The issue is overinvestment, and it's difficult to use a tool from the 70s to fix today's problems. Not impossible, but difficult.
Thank you. And of course, you know, Dina, obviously the Attorney General has been leading on the issue of predatory equity, which you talked a little bit about earlier, and issues of investor fraud. And so what are some of the trends that you're seeing from that perspective?
It's actually interesting, based on what Wendy was just saying about CRA and sort of, is it a good tool, isn't it a good tool? I recognize what you're saying exactly, although I would sort of say, in some ways, I think the good news as far as trends go and what we're seeing is that some of the banks, the large lending institutions, the Wall Street banks, who frankly did engage in some of this over-leveraging in the last go-round 10 years ago, are seemingly not doing that as much now. And we're seeing sort of a pullback. And, you know, I've had some folks in the industry come up to me at a cocktail thing like this and be like, you know, you should see the deals we're turning down. And I'm like, that's great, good. The downside, but the downside of that is that has created a vacuum in the market. And now what we're seeing, which I don't actually think, or at least I was not aware of in the last go round, is that private equity is now stepping in, and institutional investors who are backing them and providing the debt for the acquisition and over-leveraging of these deals. That's troubling for a number of reasons, but for me, one of the big reasons is that it's an even more opaque, less regulated space. And so we're having a lot of trouble. And in fact, some of these deals, I think, we're finding they're private placements, they're not public placements, so there's not even SEC filings, right? That's just all happening quietly between institutional investors and these big private equity firms. And it raises a serious question for us, I think, as an enforcement agency about what right we have or what avenue we have to sort of attack that. And so, you know, it's troubling. Again, it's good news, bad news, right? But the bad news is that I'm even more worried about how to hold accountable an industry that has very little accountability.
So I had a question for my colleagues here. If I was to tell you that the market was to change in 3 years, that the money was going to dry up, not be as interested in affordable properties, and go back to normalcy because the market was going to change, how would you think differently about what you're doing now? Either the AG or the community folks.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, since you turned the tables on us.
This wasn't in my notes.
The woman that spoke in the prior panel from Chicago, she was thanking, thankful that the recession came because it gave them time to organize and lay out the policy priorities. Similarly, I can tell you that, Gowanus was a neighborhood that was going to be rezoned under Bloomberg, and then because the US EPA decided to nominate the Gowanus Canal as a Superfund site, the Bloomberg administration decided that Gowanus was too complicated a neighborhood to rezone. I can tell you we're pretty thankful for that. And I know Brad, Councilmember Lander, was too, because we had a chance to do the Bridging Gowanus process that helped lay out some of the community priorities. So I think it allows a neighborhood to kind of take stock and lay out some priorities.
I actually thought of one. That's a really good question. So, one of the things is, right, we have just come through that exact pattern. The market was crazy, and then the crash. And one of the things we didn't do was prepare for the crash, right? And so there probably was an opportunity, a short opportunity, in which we could have, in the collective, right, as the affordable housing community, could have stepped in, acquired these things, and tried to lock them into long-term programs with long-term subsidies. And frankly, we weren't ready. We just weren't, and then that opened up for what I described earlier, which is these sort of bottom feeder type speculators who don't know anything about real estate and sort of find themselves, and it just sort of cycles back. So I would say, even if it's not true that you can predict what's going to happen in 3 years, and I'm betting you can, right? but eventually this will crash again, right? We know the cycle, and we know it will crash again, and I sort of do think it's hard because we want to sort of deal with what's in front of us right now, but we probably should spend a little time preparing for how to do better when all of this comes crumbling.
So that's our segue, actually, I think, and we only have a little less than 10 minutes left for this half of the panel, and then we're going to get to hear from some of the folks that are implementing or trying to implement some of these ideas. But what are some of the strategies or policy discussions that you all are aware of in relation to displacement and equitable development that you want to share? Actually, I'm going to start with Wendy.
Sure. My prop out.
Take your prop, yeah.
So I actually want to bring everybody's attention to a great report on Asian American and Pacific Islander anti-displacement strategies, which was put out by the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Community Development Organizations. I know that's kind of a mouthful. And it highlights actually a number of things, including some that were mentioned on the last panel, like home site, with a lot of work being done in Portland and Seattle and San Francisco. And I think one of the interesting things around the Asian Pacific Islander community and anti-displacement is that we face a lot of the same issues that are faced by places like Harlem and Bed-Stuy that are historic communities of color, as well as some of the challenges faced by Native Americans who are dealing with, the folks in Hawaii are dealing with some of the homesteading and tribal lands issues. So there's a lot of issues that I think people don't necessarily think about in the API community, and there's huge poverty in the API community, and some of the hardest hit amongst the recession. It's got a whole bunch of statistics in here, but the API community lost 44% of its wealth, which is very similar to the African American community, which lost 45%, and lower than the Hispanic community at 57%, but much higher than the white community at 19%. So there's a huge need there, and this report, so I won't go into it, but has about 25 different strategies that are going on to fight displacement, and they are everything from regulatory and policy, community engagement, bank programs. So it's really a range of things, because there wasn't one factor that causes displacement, and there's not going to be one factor that fixes it. So urge people to look at the report.
Thanks for sharing that resource. Michelle, obviously, you and your coalition, folks out in East New York and Cypress Hills, came up with a very significant list of recommendations. You want to share what the status of those recommendations are and some things you're involved in currently?
Sure. I mean, the top priority for the Coalition for Community Advancement that fought on the East New York rezone, as well as other advocates in East New York, was deeper and permanent affordability of the housing to be built. So when all is said and done, there will be 6,400 units of new housing that will be built in the community, 50% affordable and 50% market rate. The 50% affordable, we have a third of the people in East New York that live with really low incomes below 30% of AMI, and only 5% of the housing that will be built will be affordable to a third of the neighborhood. So continuing to push, citywide to our legislators that we need to go deeper. If we're going to really have an impact on displacement, we have to build to the lowest income people, housing that's affordable to the lowest income people of the city. Other displacement prevention strategies that we really push that didn't get a lot of traction, but we're not giving up hope, is a flip tax, particularly on small homes, that if a home is flipped for 100% profit, 80% profit within a very short time period, that some of that appreciation in value should go to the city of New York to preserve affordable housing in the long term. We'd like to implement cease and desist legislation in the neighborhood. Homeowners are constantly barraged by sales phone calls, by people knocking at their doors, and the people that are most vulnerable, other people just, kind of ignore it, but the most vulnerable are those homeowners, and we have big percentage of those homeowners, senior citizen homeowners and homeowners that have been through the foreclosure cycle before. They are extremely vulnerable to the barrage of sales calls. We'd like to, one of the really positive things that came out of the rezoning was this $12 million Small Homes Preservation Fund that will hopefully jumpstart the legalization of basement apartments, which is this reservoir of affordable housing in small homes neighborhoods. I think hopefully that strategy can work and it can be scaled up in a very significant way in the city. Other legislation and policy ideas that have been mentioned that we are very supportive of are land banking, community land trusts. Those are all things that, in coalition with other advocacy groups, are going to continue to fight and advocate for.
Great. Now, Dean, I know that that you and the AG's office are involved in a couple different efforts, obviously in the foreclosure prevention front, and then also in the working group that Commissioner Rubin, I think, also mentioned earlier.
Right, so I actually also want to give a shout out to the Center for New York City Neighborhoods who's here. We have worked, so I should say that the Attorney General, to his credit, has done a tremendous amount of housing related stuff, which is not sort of traditionally the role of an Attorney General. So I'm very pleased and proud that I work there and work for, he knows how important these issues are. As what Michelle was just talking about regarding, homeowners who are still in the foreclosure process and backed up because of the judicial nature of the New York foreclosure timeline, we are seeing this not just in New York City, but also Long Island and the Hudson Valley. Terrible, terrible scams directed at senior citizens, people who are still in foreclosure. It used to be when the market wasn't quite so strong, and it was like, write us a check for $5,000 and we'll get you a mortgage modification, and then you never see them again. Now they actually want the house. So we're seeing this massive uptick in deed theft, and with the center, the AG's office has created a web-based app, which we're very proud of, called AG Scam Help, that is meant to drive homeowners away from these types of scams. You can check it out on your smartphone, AG Scam Help. Away from scammers and to this network of legal services and housing counseling providers, which we've also been funding since 2012 when the Attorney General signed the National Mortgage Settlement. So we've made a $100 million commitment to keep free housing counseling and legal services available to homeowners across the state. And so we're very proud of that, and I do want folks to check out AG Scam Help because it's cool. The other thing is what, again, Commissioner Rubin talked about earlier. It's been very exciting to be in a functioning, good partnership with HPD, HCR, DOB, and when needed, right, we're working very closely with all of the legal service groups, so, South Brooklyn and Legal Aid, on trying to figure out new strategies to prevent the type of harassment that we're seeing in rent-regulated housing again. I will say, there's been some success stories. We had a very, high profile arrest of a really aggressive landlord on the other side. There's been a couple more. There's been some settlement agreements. I think the key to that relationship, though, is, again, it functions pretty well. There's just a lot of desire to work together in a really sort of nice way. But the other piece is sort of an early warning system, and I think we're starting to work a little bit harder on how to figure out where we're likely to see this type of harassment happen before everybody's been displaced from the building. So there have been cases where we get out to inspect a building, and there's 2 tenants left. Everybody's taken the buyout or left or been taken to court. And so if we can get out there earlier, we're actually on the good side, on the positive side, seeing landlords desperately don't want to be on this list in some cases. So that's very helpful to know, right? And if we can get out to the buildings before the displacement happens, I think that task force can be much more effective.
And I just want to do a quick shout out, because I know we have to wrap up, to the Stabilizing NYC Coalition, which is 14 different groups, working with UHAB and the Urban Justice Center really on a number of predatory equity issues, in particular focused on rent-stabilized housing throughout the 5 boroughs. And I'm sure in the next panel we're going to hear from Councilmember Lander and Commissioner Bean about the citywide anti-harassment working group, which is really focused, obviously, on one of the, if not in my mind, the most significant follow-up item from the MIH and the ZQA conversation, which was really about having citywide legislation related to harassment and displacement and preventing that from happening. So with that, I am just going to say thank you all very much, and I know that our next panel will hopefully take some of the examples and trends and come up with some ideas for implementation.
Thank you, Michelle.